Good evening, everyone. I am Laura Burkhalter, curator at the Des Moines Arts Center and curator of the Monument Valley exhibition. As many of you know, we start our events with a land acknowledgement. This land on which we gather is the traditional and ancestral land of the Native Americans who preceded us, and we honor those who are still with us. Speaking of acknowledgements, I am looking out at this audience and I see many people who have come to multiple events for the Monument Valley exhibition. We've had a lot of them. This is the last one, and it makes me really happy to see people who have been to 2 or 3 or even more. So thank you all very much for making this happen. I also see a lot of my fellow staff members, and museum exhibitions and museum events do not happen because of one people, they happen because of all of us. So thank you all very much as well. I also want to thank my guests here tonight. I am going to do a very official introduction for each one of our wonderful guests here, and then I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But I also first want to thank Wendy Red Star for this event specifically. Museums sometimes can move slowly, and we sometimes do things the same way very often. And it was actually through conversation with Wendy, she challenged Jill and I to do something besides a traditional artist lecture. So she gets a little extra credit for why we're all here tonight. I'm going to embarrass Wendy just a little bit more. I first saw Wendy's work about, I think, 7 years ago at a show in Kansas City, and I made it my mission to get her work and hopefully her to this museum at some point for my audience. So that's one of my little professional goals checked off the list there. I'm really thrilled that everybody is here tonight. So I'm going to introduce you first now that I've embarrassed you. So, Wendy Red Star works across disciplines to explore the intersections of Native American ideologies and colonialist structures, both historically and in contemporary society. Wendy has exhibited in the United States and abroad at venues including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Foundation Cartier, the Nelson Atkins, Portland Art Museum, the Hood Art Museum, St. Louis Art Museum, and the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, among many others. She holds a BFA from Montana State University, Bozeman, and an MFA in sculpture from University of California, LA. Our next guest is Dr. Jordan Amirkhani. She is an art historian, critic, and educator. She serves as professorial lecturer in art history at American University in DC. Her research and writing reflect her commitment to intersectional feminist critique and the contextualization of issues of gender, class, and race within the development of European and American art from the 19th century to the present. She is a regular contributor to Art Forum, Burnaway, and Daily Serving, among other publications. Our next guest is Ryan McMahon. Ryan is an Anishinaabe comedian, writer, media maker, and community activator based out of Treaty No. 1 territory, Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. He is the co-creator of the podcast Thunder Bay, which explores crime, racial tension, and government corruption in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and has been downloaded 1.5 million times. A graduate of the Second City Conservatory in Toronto, Ryan's comedic storytelling style is fast-paced, loose, and irreverent, and explores the good, the bad, and the ugly between Indian country and the mainstream. In 2012, McMahon became the first Native comedian to ever record a full mainstream comedy special with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And Ryan has written for the Globe and Mail, Vice Media, CBC, CBC Aboriginal, and Aboriginal People's Television Network. So please welcome this very prestigious panel. So I hope for tonight is a engaging conversation, and I've got all these sort of long questions to moderate, but really what I'm hoping is because we have these great guests here, that it's more of a conversation between them. So as I said, I'm gonna let each of you sort of introduce yourselves in your own words, how you like to talk about you and your work, and we'll just see where it goes from there. So Jordan, I'm gonna start with you.
Cool, thank you so much for having me, Laura, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. I would say that maybe the most important aspect of my work is being an educator, but I think that manifests in all of the other practices that I have. So as a curator, I am constantly thinking about how to sort of invite my sense of education and specifically being a teacher of art history into the conversation when I curate. And in my criticism and writing as well, I'm constantly thinking about what it means to engage education as part of a writing practice, and specifically to think about how how I come to institutions, art institutions specifically as an educator, and in particular, I am a Persian American, and I think constantly about my education in Western art history and how it is very often in conversation as well as conflict with the way in which being an immigrant and outside of Western culture and context affects how I see things, how I engage art, and how I have manifested my own tastes and my own sort of perspective within art history. So to complement the very lovely introduction you gave, I would say I'm probably thinking about institutional critique a lot in a variety of my practices, which we can talk about tonight.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you for including my voice in the exhibition, Laura, and that's awesome. I think I had some people come to a solo exhibition I had at the Figgy.
I think some of them are probably here.
Okay. And so it's just kind of amazing because that was a few years ago, and that you continue to have faith and support, and here I am. So it's just kind of a wonderful feeling. So I really appreciate that. I'm really honored to also be sitting here with Jordan, who I think is just incredible, especially as an Indigenous artist. Jordan has written about my work, and she's just done an excellent job of propelling my work and including my voice in the sort of contemporary art context, which is where it should be. And I'm totally obsessed with Ryan's podcast, Thunder Bay. So I was just like very much geeking out over sitting here with him. But yeah, I think as of late, I'm really interested in genealogy, my family's genealogy. I feel really propelled by my ancestors. I just found my third great grandmother. Her name's Julia Bad Boy. Her dad's name was Bad Boy. That was just his name, which is awesome. And her crow name was Dreams the Truth. And so I was able to find her doing a residency at the National Museum of the American Indian. And also a fourth great grandfather, and his name is Greenskin. And they just started kind of coming out of the woodworks. So right now I'm just really propelled by them, and I feel like they've really reached out to me to kind of say, hey, our stories have been interrupted. Can you share them? So I'm just really deeply interested in that and feel really strong about the work that I'm making, and hopefully the privileges that I get to travel around and look at different collections and piece together these histories. It's like a puzzle that the next generation, my daughter's generation, and going forward, they'll have that little platform and can continue to build on that. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. So it's really fun to be supported in that. It's actually quite amazing. And also to be included and supported in exhibitions as the one that we have here. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
Bonjour, Ghana Washum, Wab Makwa, Indigenous Kaz Makwando Dem, Kuching and Donje. I introduced myself in my language, and what I've said in the Ojibwe language is pass your wallets to the front. This is a stick up. If we're not getting the land back, we are getting your credit cards, so let's have the wallets. I'll wait. It's always the last beat where I get the most joy. So, yeah, it's really quite a privilege to be here. I don't know how I was invited or why quite to be a part of a conversation like this. As a comedian, you don't get asked to do things like this very often. So I hope I don't screw it up. And it's been an amazing couple of days here with this group, and to have the complete privilege of walking through the museum today and to see the show with one of the artists and to get so much story, so much rich story and perspective on the works. Made me feel dumb and then made me feel smart. So it's been a good day. As far as my own participation here this evening, I think the one thing I think I might be able to add to this is the importance of Indigenous storytelling and the need to recenter Indigenous voices today and going forward. And I think that for me and my work, so much of my practice revolves around telling old stories in new ways, and we'll never run out of stories to tell. And as far as the work that I'm really interested in and engaged in, it is pushing back against what I call the colonial settler myth of North America. And so really challenging people through comedy and through laughter, but also just through the plain good old truth is really, really important. The word for truth in my language is Dabwewin. But of course, the English language is a complete failure it's a miserable failure of a language. And so some of you are already mad at me, which is what I'm here for. So Dabwewin, which translates to truth in English, actually when you break down that word in my language, what it is actually talking about is to speak from a place of love and good spirit only to the extent of your experiences. And so to explore the truth is to share your experience with others through a place of good spirit and love. And hopefully that's what I do tonight, and that's been my experience here the last 2 days. So miigwech, it's really, really nice to be here tonight.
We put you in the anchor seat so you can wrap things up really beautifully like that. And you actually set me up really well. So storytelling is something that was important for you for the exhibition. It's clearly important to all of your work, and we called this panel discussion active voice, which is sort of a grammatical term, but the thing that I think you all have in common when I was doing research about your work is that your work is called activist or called political, and often any work that is not from a white, straight male perspective is often deemed political or activist. And I know that I think you all probably have some really strong feelings about the label activist and what that implies and what it might mean or whether it's necessary. So why don't you all tell me what you think about being political or activist in your work? Is that good, bad, ugly, whichever? Who wants to start? You had really strong feelings about this earlier, so why don't you?
Well, my grandmother, who was a residential school survivor, told me really early on in my life that everything you do is political as an Indigenous person. So we never get to escape the political. The political follows us everywhere we go every day. And so it's not really a choice that we get to make, whether we engage in the discourse or in the activism, blocking highways, fighting for clean drinking water in Canada, flying the flag of over 4,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. I mean, depending on what we're talking about as activism, I mean, those are choices. But I mean, if wanting to build a good and just society for all is activism, then, sign me up. But as far as I'm concerned, everyone here should want that. So you're all activists. If I have to wear the title, then so should everyone. And so for me, that term is obnoxious. But it's also something that we can't necessarily avoid or even ignore, because it does become a part of a sort of a responsibility I think we have.
I have a really vivid memory in undergrad. I discovered that where I was going to school in Bozeman, Montana was about a 3 hours drive away from my reservation, the Crow Reservation. And I learned that Bozeman was actually originally Crow territory. And there was this chief during the Fort Laramie Treaty in 1851 who was asked to define our territory. And he used this beautiful metaphor. He said, "My home is where my teepee sits." And I took that very literally. I was like, "Oh, that sucks. It's not very much land, But the way that Crows set up teepees is we use these 4 foundation poles, and then you set the rest of the poles up on those 4 foundation poles. And so he took the 4 foundation poles, and then he said he placed them on the major migration routes that we take throughout the season, and that mapped out 38.5 million acres. And he said, "My home is where my teepee sits." I thought, that's so badass. And then I looked at the map and I was like, "Oh, whoa, Bozeman, that's Crow country." And I got so excited about that. And there was a visiting professor from Yale at the time. And I told my dad, I really want to do a project. I want to harvest lodgepoles and from the reservation and bring them and then set them up around campus. And I want to honor our ancestors, but I also want to let the community here know that this is Crow territory. And so set them up, and they were getting knocked down, and then eventually I was like, "Well, screw it, I'll just stick it on the football field," and that was awesome. But the vivid memory is that the visiting professor from Yale said to me, "Wendy, you're so political. You make such political work." And I got really butthurt by that. Because when he said that, I felt like he was saying that I was sort of going against the grain and kind of being a troublemaker. And it really bothered me. And then it wasn't until several years later that what I realized was actually I was coming from this really pure place of celebration and saying this is fact, this was Crow country. And to him it was sort of rubbing up against sort of the rubbing up against the norm, which is colonial society. And anything outside of that norm is going to be political. And it dawned on me several years later that's what he was saying. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting. For me as an Indigenous person, this is reality and fact. And you're saying, oh no, this is outside of that colonial norm. So that was super interesting to me. And so to me, I still feel like I'm just stating, part of history that has not been promoted or shared, and if that seems political then to you, then there's something beyond that we need to start talking about.
Y'all are so smart and great. Wow. I feel like I'm just gonna sit here and learn a bunch of things. I would say that it's only been recently that the term political or activist has been attached to my work, which has been kind of a surprise to me, because it's have you guys been reading anything, the whole thing? I've always been writing from this perspective, and it's only recently that it's sort of become labeled in this way, which is interesting to me. I very much feel that my writing is a part of telling the truth and being historically accurate. I'm an art historian by training and trade, and I feel like I entered into art history in a moment where the borders between traditional art history as a formalist aesthetic narrative was not only being subverted, but being complicated by a more interdisciplinary practice of anthropology, of cultural studies, of film and other sort of visual arts medium that I inherited as normal, but I think generations past saw as a pretty new and maybe radical thing. So for me, as someone, like I said, who comes from an art history background, I feel like I'm more invested in telling the historical story behind a work of art than engaging in any kind of sort of ahistorical aesthetic mediated experience. And what that has resulted in is that it forces you, when you are doing super historically engaged work and socially engaged work, that you begin to realize that the tradition of art history has been ahistorical for a really long time for very political purposes. that not engaging in politics is a political position. And one of the things that I have cared about as I have continued to sort of grow in my own voice and think about what I want to contribute in this discourse and landscape is I want to think about why women's work in the art field has always been labeled immediately as one about identity and politics, and that has historically been a way to empty women's practices from being considered as centered and mainstream, because this idea of engaging in one's identity or one's identity politics has been a way to demean the seriousness and the kind of aesthetic capacity of women's writing or women's practices of all kinds. So for me, I care very much about supporting women artists and using my writing as a way of advocating for women who are not only engaging their identity, but also engaging within the discourse of art, very often first and foremost. So I think, as Wendy said, I've written a few things about her practice in the past few years, and my first intention was to engage her as a contemporary artist because that's what she is. And she is in conversation with her own time, and her subject matter happens to be sometimes about your identity, but you are also a photographer engaging in the discourse of photography. You are also engaging in a wider national and international conversation that is rich and that gets leveraged and afforded to other artists all the time, and why not you? And so I think for me, activism is a great word, and it can be helpful to engage an audience if you are labeled in that way, but I am very committed to being, both in my criticism and in my scholarly work and in my curatorial work, that I am a historian. I'm just being historically accurate. And if that's a political choice, then sorry.
I mean, museums have, we're in this conversation
Right.
too, and I think people who have seen the recent shows at the Art Center, the response has sometimes been, the Art Center is suddenly doing these political shows.
Yeah.
And it's not really that we're doing shows that are more political, it's just that we're being more open about talking about the fact that there's always politics. It's just, do you acknowledge that, or do you not acknowledge that, or do you
Right.
talk about certain things differently? And I think we're just learning to be more transparent about the structures that were in place that kept certain artists out of the conversation, or acknowledging that if we really are a contemporary art museum, we need to be engaging in what contemporary humans are talking about and living.
Well, and what a privilege it is to not be political.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
It's the greatest privilege in the world is to not be political, where you understand the politics are going to take care of you because they were meant for you. So, if you choose not to engage in that conversation, it's because you're literally the benefactor of white supremacy. And that supremacy helps you sleep at night because you don't have to think about it. And so if we're making work and it happens to be in response to something that is happening in the world, it's political and it's a threat. But I don't know any other way to live. If I get labeled a political comedian, it's meant as slander. It's meant that I'm taking an easier way to jokes because Trump is an asshole. So it's easy. Of course, you'll never run out of things to write about Donald Trump. So when someone goes, well, he's a political comic, they mean it as a put down. But we don't have a choice. We're still, I think in 2019, we're literally fighting for our lives every day as Indigenous folks, right? So we don't have a choice. It's not a switch we can turn on and off.
So that being said, and actually this will lead into Wendy, conversations about, so do you feel, when you're doing a comedy show or you're in an exhibition, I mean, I can imagine that you both clearly you want your Indigenous identity respected and acknowledged, but you also want to be part of contemporary discourse and be respected as a contemporary artist, as a contemporary comedian. How do you talk with people who are used to the system, the status quo and the system, and how do you sort of negotiate that? I think probably, well, no, I know probably, people who never think about those things don't really even, I think, often know how to begin to have that balance. And so it's just easier to say, this is an Indigenous comedian, she's an Indigenous artist, and not think about that nuanced space in between, which is probably, I would hope, closer to the truth that both of those things are important and valuable. So how do you make sure that that space is being, like, you're respecting, getting the respect you deserve within that space? Or what do you want to tell all of us so we can help you, or we can do better about getting that space? Yeah. Well, and like I said, I mean, when I first started really looking at Wendy's work, it was really confusing to me that I always saw it in Indigenous galleries. Because when I saw your work, I saw contemporary art. That was what I saw. Clearly, you were working within a subject matter that was personal to you, but it didn't seem any different to me than work that other contemporary artists were doing. But I understood somebody, a curator or you, I wasn't really sure, who had made that decision to put your work in that gallery. And I just wanted to know more about, like, the process. Were you left out of it? Were you included in it? What it was? And I know that from talking to now many Indigenous contemporary artists, I know that there's a lot of bad answers, a lot of unfortunate answers to that question, and people weren't respected and didn't feel empowered to sort of say, I want to be in this place. So, and I want to make sure that moving forward that I'm always giving people what they need to answer me one way or the other with where they want to be.
I think for me, I've always just been like making art and really in love with making art, and sort of that's been the motivation. And then once I got deeper into it, I realized, oh, this person is putting me in this category or that category. And so, I don't know, being older now, I realize that has nothing to do with me at all. You know, I'm just Wendy, and I'm making art, and, you know, that's not my shit. And, but I think something that is interesting with my career is that it's been mostly like museum-based. I don't really have a commercial gallery. I just started working with a gallery this year. And for the most part, those museum shows have been because of the curator of the Native galleries, who's an anthropologist. So I've been working a lot with anthropologists, not contemporary arts curators. And so therefore, you saw my work. Where did you see it?
I saw it in the Plains Indian show at the Nelson Atkins.
Yeah, and so and actually he has an art history background, but I feel like he's more like an anthropologist. But so that's real. I think that is fascinating. That sort of these anthropologists, like even at the Denver Art Museum, most of them are from anthropology. They're seeing me as a contemporary artist, a very necessary voice that they need to help within that context of their gallery space. And then, you know, artist friends are like, it doesn't matter, you know, if you got in the back door, the side door, whatever, you're in the institution and you're showing the work. And to me, the goal is the work itself. But like, it's interesting to have work with these anthropologists, and they're coming to my work completely different than in this sort of contemporary art context. And they're able to get things out of that work and have conversations very differently about the work. But for instance, at the Nelson Atkins Museum, there's a custody agreement of a work that's in their collection that is shared with the photography and the contemporary art and the Native galleries, and they share that work, and it sort of floats between like whatever show they're having, like photography is having a show, then like that work's up for grabs there. So I don't know, it's such a weird space. I don't talk to a lot of other artists, other than maybe other Indigenous artists who are kind of in the same dilemma as well. But for me, the end goal is always like, this is the work that I'm invested in and interested in, and that it's being supported, and all of that stuff like catch up when you catch up, then like, but right for now, it's just like those labels aren't my. I'm not going to engage with them. I'm not really interested in them. I don't really care.
I'm just gonna say one thing. Marcel Duchamp was making personal work, like Jackson Pollock was making personal work, Andy Warhol was making personal work, but it seems to me that this adjective of identity that has been wielded by institutions and in the contemporary discourse since the 90s has been a way to talk specifically about those who have been historically and marginally decentered from the history of art. And so as institutions become more invested in telling more and different kinds of stories, I continue to think about the ways in which identity, now that it has been included more intentionally within museum rhetoric, how identity is now allowing a sort of difference or a kind of ghettoization of artists in difference from those who are not engaging in identity politics, meaning the more mainstream canonical artists who are just making art with a capital A, no adjective included. So just to sort of think about what, in response to what Wendy said, I think I am all for identity politics being a part of the conversation, but it can't be the way in which we control other artists' stories. Just as and very often I think identity gets wielded in terms of surface appearances and what people look like or how they are engaging differently with their bodies or with their material or with their style in relationship to more white mainstream artists. And so I'm in a moment right now where I'm actually thinking about not using the word identity anymore in my own writing, because I think it's doing some wrong things right now, or it's been turned into a different thing.
What will you use then?
I don't know. We should talk about it.
Yeah.
Maybe we should just talk about art. Okay.
You mentioned in my bio in 2012, I became the first Native comedian to do a 1-hour TV special. The first joke I told on stage during that special was, I only got this comedy special because they thought I was white, because I look white. Do you see me? Hi. Not self-conscious at all about being white passing. Spent an hour talking about it on TV. Not proud of it, but what are you going to do? It's sad, not funny, folks. Come on. Very insecure. Then, getting ready for that special, it was like they were really combing over my material and thinking about accessibility. So I'm talking about, and last night at dinner we talked about audience. And I think for me, if I'm in a soft seat theater and there's 400 people there, I have a chance to have a conversation, a one-way conversation. Sometimes there's heckling. Do not heckle me, sir. That's not an invitation. I do this for a living. I'm very good at it. I'm just kidding. But a conversation with folks that don't have access to our lives and don't know about what it's like to live the lives we live. And so I use one of my greatest heroes and mentors was Charlie Hill, who was an Oneida comedian, who I became very close with in 2009 and spent a lot of time with. And my favorite quote he gave me was, comedy is too important not to be taken seriously. And so what he was pointing at for me was, you have a chance to have that conversation when folks have come out. And so you do have to figure out a way to build a doorway give people a chance to walk through this doorway that you're presenting on the evening. And they get to walk through it and they discover what's in the room, and a lot of people run out and go, ooh, not for me. But some people will walk through that doorway and stay in there and look in the dark corners and kind of check out the decor and try to figure out whether they agree or not, or whether they're further interested. And so I think in my context in the sort of Native comedy world, we've not even yet scratched the surface of what that conversation is with an audience, because, you know, most audiences are expecting brown cheekbones, braids, you know, and those guys are out there. But it's up to us to have a very intentional conversation with our audience that pushes back against sort of the Hollywood trope. Yeah.
And that just so much about how one gets sort of marginalized or not is about power, not necessarily about other more sort of visible things. Because I am also a white passing person, and though my experience will tell a different thing, I think I also get the rewards of passing a lot, which I'm very conscious of, in the ways in which my sister, for instance, or my dad does not. And so what representation means is something very different for me than it is for persons who walk in the world differently and who are marked in the world differently by others, and their experiences are different. And so for me, again, like this issue of identity, I think sometimes is a real sort of homogenizing word that allows only certain kind of identities to fill in that space that are visibly apparent, but that may not actually articulate the way in which one exists within a relationship of a power structure that may not be as visible, but is, of course, deeply there.
Which sucks, because then you're like, there's 600 people in a theater, I better hit them with everything that I can because I have this privilege, so I have to write about being Native, and I have to write about pushing against the casino myth, and like, so you feel like you have to check all these boxes. There's all this pressure to do all the things, and that's not funny. Like, that's not, so I always ask the question, like, am I being creative? Am I writing art? Am I writing what I'm super proud of and what I want to talk about? Or am I reacting to the world? Is my practice a constant reaction because of? And so that, I mean, it's a tricky, very personal dance. You know, I'm years into my comedy career, and I don't know that I'll ever find the answer, because, you know, I want to talk about the world around me, but you know, I also feel like I have to teach these folks what's really up, you know, so.
I mean, I definitely want to talk about comedy because it is something that both of you, Wendy, you use in your work and you use as a profession. So who thinks that art museums are funny? Few people gonna raise your hand?
We're going for drinks after. Everyone that said yes, we're going for drinks after.
I want to talk to everyone.
I like that.
I mean, it's not something that, although I can name a lot of artists that use comedy in their work, it's just not often something that we write about, that we think about. And comedy is a really sharp weapon, and to laugh at something, there has to be some sort of empathy or like human connection to get a laugh. And I'm really interested in how you guys both sort of see comedy in the grand scheme of things, and then also sort of from an art history point of view, like what's the place in that story? So I'll let you, Wendy, go ahead. You've got the mic there.
Oh, I mean, to me, it's like humor kind of runs very deep. Just like in my family is very sarcastic. So there's that. But then also culturally, the Crow tribe, we're a matrilineal society, and we have a clan system. So you're born into a clan, and then with that clan also comes a set of teasing cousins. And so it's sort of this policing system that we have where their job is to kind of keep you in line, but also to lift your spirits. So for instance, if anyone gets a big head and starts bragging and your teasing cousin catches wind, you know, people will tell them, like, so-and-so, Wendy was like really bragging and whatever. And then your teasing cousin's job is to come and publicly humiliate you. Or like, for instance, my dad, you know, is a cancer survivor, and he used to go to Indian Health Service, and he would always tell my mom, please take me side door, because my teasing cousin's at, the front, and just can't handle it. But really, his teasing cousin was there to kind of lift his spirits, and so they're also there for that as well. But there's always these loopholes too. So you can always, in Crow culture, the way to kind of get around that is somebody else can brag for you. So everyone, in the family can brag about you as much as they want. And that's very much like the way to go. So, I mean, culturally, like there's that. I come from this culture that it's sort of infused with, we have clowns and things like that. But for me, I really do feel like humor, especially in my work, and even when I talk to people, I'll say something really messed up. Like I was talking about my alcoholic uncle just before this. And I was laughing, even though it was pretty brutal, what I was saying. And anyways, I won't get into that. But there's a lot of pain there.
Comedy is often
A ton of pain there. And like
often.
in the White Squaw series, that's pain there. That's the way like Indigenous women have been looked at and stuff like that. And when I first saw those books, the White Squaw books, I just didn't even know what to do with them. But I kept coming back to them, and then I just bought all of them, eBay. And I just like wrestled with them, like literally grappled with them. And so for me, comedy is healing. It's healing to me, and I just remember, as a Native person, especially on my reservation, you go to funerals all the time. It's so weird for me to be around somebody who hasn't actually gone to a funeral, or just recently. I'm like, what? I've been going to those like since I was like 6 months old or something like that. And I just always remember at funerals, someone will like start cracking jokes, and it's the most amazing and beautiful experience where you're so down, and then someone says something funny, and it's like such a relief. And to me, I feel like with the heavy topics that I'm working with, that's how I can get into them, because it can be pretty brutal. And so if I'm feeling that, I'm also sensing the audience is going to be totally turned off. So if there's an in for them to get into it, and to sit there and have a moment with the work through that doorway of humor, then that's an approach to me to reach some sort of kind of understanding and some sort of healing with it. But yeah, I'll laugh, but behind that laughter, I think there's a lot of heavy sort of sadness.
Yeah, we have a few words in our language that, when translated, talks about like adsokanin, tabajimunan. These are words that point to the care of spirit through stories, and so these are through our clan systems. These are responsibilities that are given through our clans, and so to be given the responsibility of lifting spirit through story is like we believe it's a sacred responsibility, and so it's also a law. So in our legal systems, in our legal traditions, Anishinaabe legal traditions, that we are obligated to take care of each other that way. It's the way we stay in good relationship. So jokes are the law, for Anishinaabe people, and so I think that like humor is the great equalizer. The tradition of humor, whether you're talking about vaudeville or you're talking about clown in the European tradition or our Indigenous tradition of clowning, it's the way to take power back, and hopefully it's the way to give power. And so I think it's a really, really important tool. And to build on and to agree with what Wendy was saying about healing, this is something that perhaps other cultures and people have said or heard, laughter is medicine. And I get why we say that, and I agree with it. But I also like to point out that it is also so much more, that it's inherently Indigenous, that it's in our storytelling tradition. our law traditions, that laughter and those trickster figures that we all have as nations, care for the stories and teach the people. And so we didn't ground our kids when they were bad. We sat them down and scared the shit out of them with a funny Nana Buju story, right? And that story we would have to tell over and over and over again until that little kid got their shit together. And then you're like, okay, he learned the lesson, you know? And so to me, that humor is so much more than just something that makes us feel good. It's us living the way we should. The one other thing I'll add, I think that is an interesting layer is, you know, with Wendy, I'm a fan of yours. I've been a fan of yours for a long time. So, and because your satirical work is so sharp and so original and so strong, you can see it doing its job, and that is such a brilliant gift when you can see the intention and the spirit behind the work so clearly. And there's this large influx of Native comedy through North America, and with the advent of social media, I mean, you have this really rich Native meme culture, which is political and hilarious. You have, you know, Facebook comedians. You have all of this really interesting work. But we also run the risk of doing it wrong in Indian country. Paul Mooney, who was Richard Pryor's head writer back in the 70s, he was the head writer for the Dave Chappelle Show. He wrote a book called Black is the New White. And in, I think, the 6th chapter, Mooney talks about he was the first, after Red Fox, he was the first black comedian in America to popularize, if you can call it that, the N-word on television. And he talked about how much he regrets that, because the comedy he was doing, he was the executive producer of Def Comedy Jam as well. He talked about that by exploiting his community through creating the N-word as a slur, and to use it against his own people through comedy, how that exploited the people and took their power away. And I feel like in Indigenous humor, we run the same risk. And so it's a really and perhaps this audience won't be so familiar with Native comedy, but I'm like the grumpy uncle of Native comedy, because I'm like, you can't do that. You can't take these memes about Native women and call them drunk single moms, and like, that's not funny. You're taking our power away from us. And I think at its best, our humor gives our people their power back. It makes us stronger. It doesn't take away from us. So what I so enjoy about your work is it gives us so much strength. And I think that when comedy is really working, it gives the people back their power.
I think humor has not historically been the framing mechanism of Western art. I think, with the tradition of history painting in European and American art, and the traditions of looking to the past and looking for a very particular past based on Greco-Roman antiquity and mythology and biblical stories and all of this sort of stuff, that, humor has not been, the grounding sort of architecture of Western art until we get to the early 20th century with the historical avant-garde. And that's when we begin to sort of see artists playing with humor, playing with the subversive nature of humor. But of course, in, movements like Dada and Surrealism, for me, as a feminist art historian, I very often think about how the joke and how the subversive sort of humor functions in those movements, and very often at the expense of women, at the expense of queer persons, at the expense of marginalized persons of all kinds. That the joke is only for a very particular audience, and that audience looks like each other, functions in society like each other, and the jokes are very often violent towards an other in a lot of ways. So one of the things that I think can be very powerful about humor in the aftermath of this is the way in which, as you just said, Ryan, that who is telling the joke is very important, and who that joke is for is maybe the most important. that not all jokes are for everyone, but that when you tell a joke, there should be a sort of recognition that it's going to land somewhere, and where does it land, and what is the aftermath of that. And I think one of the incredible things that I resonate with in what you said about Wendy's work is that the joke is her joke. And it's a joke that she has taken for herself and is leveraging into the institution by, through herself. And that joke is not for everyone. And that can be a really powerful move and can actually subvert a power structure by sort of seizing the joke for oneself and allowing it to make other persons uncomfortable. I think that, to me, particularly in the White Squaw series in the galleries, is the thing that I think about a lot, that like that joke is not for everyone. And that joke is also not going to feel the same for everyone who looks at it. And that is a real sort of subversion of a power structure where the joke is actually political in a good way, not political at the expense of another person without power.
And and you're lucky that with this show here, you have Wendy's work and you have Kent Monkman's work. So now that we've framed it in a humorous context, go back and look at Monkman's work in this gallery, and I dare you not to laugh because it's hilarious.
I can also say, I walked through the museum with these three today, and it's very funny. There's a lot of inappropriate jokes about male artists, and I really enjoyed that a lot.
Sorry.
It could definitely be its own comedy routine, and it did feel like, as a curator, I'm supposed to. I've worked with this collection forever, and I have a defense of all of these works. So hearing you guys, I'm not going to name names, but hearing you guys like just sort of freely, not just make fun of this work, but question its authority, question its place, personally, that felt awesome. Because I don't necessarily, as a curator here, I don't necessarily have the freedom to do that, and it felt important to a certain, as funny and lighthearted as it was. I started to think about why am I a little bit why do I feel weird that they're making fun of this artist? And then I realized it's because I sort of feel like for whatever reason I'm not allowed to do that, and then that felt weird too. So I actually really appreciated that sort of lighthearted approach and your willingness to take a chunk out of whoever it was without sort of that, oh, this is important artwork and I'm not supposed to make fun of it. So I loved it. I wish you could have all heard it.
Make fun of all the white male artists. It's fine.
What are the lyrics to that song? We're here for a good time, not a long time. So have a good time.
Absolutely.
Sun don't shine every day. Good night, ladies and gentlemen.
Actually, I'm going to take that as a segue. So I've been asking a lot of questions and brought up a lot of topics. Do you guys have any questions for each other? Anything goes in front of all these people? You look like you're so close there.
I guess for Ryan, I have a question, especially regarding your podcast and talking about a town and a specific community and specific individuals. And for me, I do a lot of work concerning my own community, but I'm so terrified, I really use this lens of my own experience. And even that, I still get shit from some people. I'm just wondering, how have you dealt with sort of, confronting or, taking on these stories? It sounds like some of the people you talk about are super scary as well. So how have you mentally dealt with that?
Yeah. The Thunder Bay podcast series takes a look at a small city in northern Ontario in Canada, and we do a deep dive into this corruption and so many difficult themes and topics. And I before we started recording interviews and and working with sources, I just kept traveling there to build relationships with people. And so for me, it was really integral to be invited, to be an invited guest. You know, you started with a territorial land acknowledgement. We're all uninvited guests here. I don't think the people that were originally here wanted to lose everything. That's not what they hoped for. So when I go somewhere, it's very important for me as a visitor to be welcomed and to understand, you know, what is actually going on. And I think listening, as someone that talks for a living, it's really important that I do a lot of listening. And so I spent a year, which when you're doing journalism, you know, that's most publishers don't want to pay for you to go listen for a year. They're like, we need tape, we need to start producing stuff because this is getting expensive. But it was really a question for me of gaining the trust. So my thing that I kept saying to our publisher was trust over tape. And so if I have the trust of the people, they'll tell me everything. And I was, I guess, the first journalist / writer to gain that trust because they told us everything. And for me, that really informs the work. It grounds, I think, why this was so important and why it's so important for Indigenous people generally to take our lives back through story is that, I mean, let's look at what Hollywood has done to us for 100 years, you know. It's really important that we take our stories back because the story of Thunder Bay was not a new story. A lot of what we talked about through the podcast was generally known in and around the city, but it was never talked about through an Indigenous lens. And so why is the podcast a hit and people want to turn it into a TV show for HBO was because it's Indigenous people talking about the world around them. And that's new. And it's so weird. It's not new for us. We talk about our world all the time. But in order to talk about that world, you have to be grounded, and it was really important to have the trust of the people. Yeah. And I don't know if we succeeded always, but that was my approach. Yeah.
Any other questions for each other? So, Jill, do you think that she's right there? And then the minute I talk to her, are we ready to open it up to audience questions? Okay. So Jill and Megan have the mics over there. So wait for the mic to be passed to you so everyone can hear what your question is.
I'm coming.
Don't use my name. I'm sorry. Forgive me. I forgive everyone. I had to pick up my wife at the airport in Des Moines here about 25 minutes, so I don't want to be late to pick her up. She works out of town. She commutes to Phoenix right now weekly for the work she does. But I couldn't help, and forgive me if this is stupid, but as you were talking, and I do have a question. It's just, do you see any connection at all with the notion of minstrelsy to the work that you do? As you were talking about comedic work, I couldn't help think about what African American, traveling groups and the vaudevillians and all that, how they did that. To a certain extent, it was a bit of a recovery. And then I think of, to a lesser extent, I don't expect you to know much about this, but I'm hoping what the Teatro Campesino was doing to the farm workers, Luis Valdez out in the camps, when they had the characters, the farm workers who would actually act as, el patron, the owner, and then the Americanized Hispanic. Sorry, I hope there's a question. I think there's a question there. Do you see any relationship or any connection to you were talking about representation earlier?
Me?
Sorry. Any of you, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ramble.
Well, there is one of the things that I intend to do eventually, which I know some others have done, is investigate vaudeville and Indigenous people in vaudeville, because I know so much of the storytelling tradition where I'm from was kept through what we now call powwow. And so, Wild Bill Cody, who creates the Wild West shows and travels around and basically holds slaves, We continue to this day, if you go to a powwow, we continue with what is called a grand entry, and the grand entry was created through these Wild West shows, and so we've adopted a lot of this really dark history into like our largest cultural celebrations, and so I think that's a really interesting paradox, and I think it's something to be talked about and investigated. And our own storytelling traditions and the intersection with vaudeville is actually really, really interesting, specifically for Anishinaabe people, because we did spend time on the East Coast, and we migrated towards the Midwest, and there are many Ojibways that during that migration ended up cruising down the Mississippi River and just never ever came home. And so you can go to New Orleans today, there's thousands of Ojibways that were just too lazy to paddle back up. And so there's a great unknown Ojibwe tradition in vaudeville as well that I intend to investigate. So I don't know that really an answer to your question, but that's, no, it's great. No, it's great.
I think that's fascinating. I kind of think about like pageantry, and I really love investigating Native delegations, well, specifically Crow ones, because I'm obsessed with Crow-centric stuff, you know. None of this Anishinaabe stuff. But
her and I are going to fight before I fly home tomorrow.
But yeah, so this history of delegations and, you know, taking Native people overseas to visit royalty and getting their paintings done, and then when Native leaders would go to Washington, D.C. to sit with presidents, they would often get their photos taken wearing their regalia, and there would be sort of this practice or this mobbing of when they would get to town, walking down the streets where you know, the townspeople would want them to like sort of parade down the street in their outfits, and then pretty soon it sort of became like less about sitting down and negotiating on the rights of their people with the president, and more about them sort of coming to DC and sort of parading down the streets in their outfits. And so there's still this pressure today that Native people feel that they have to, in order for them to, like, a lot of times people, you know, when they meet me, they're like surprised because they see like the Four Seasons or something like that where I'm in my regalia, and they're like, you look nothing like that. And so there's still this idea of pageantry, like you're only authentic if you're in your outfit, and yeah, there's this, I feel sort of sad for all the Native people. There's like this pressure, and you'll see it like where they get up and they're invited to do a TED Talk, and they're full on in their regalia, you know. And so there's you know, I just want to tell them there's this long history of us being placed in sort of that position. You know, there's one way where you need to assimilate into Western culture, but for entertainment, will you please, you know, like, you know, be Native, and, you know, in order to do that, wear your outfit and stuff. So I think that's fascinating.
And I used to, this is embarrassing, but I might as well just I would wear beadwork. So people.
Of course you did.
So now I'm just giving her ammunition for the gun at this point, but I stopped. I stopped wearing beadwork about 3 years ago or so, just because I thought, well, who's this for? Like, I don't need to wear this. It's heavy and it stinks like smoked moose hide, and I don't, you know, why am I wearing this again? And it was for that reason, because I realized, and people would just touch it and like, let me see, and so yeah, so that pageantry, I think, is a really there is a long history of it, which continues to this day in so many different ways.
It does. I mean, even I can kind of even see in my daughter too as well, like her feeling it too, and I'm like, whoa, this is very heavy. Yeah.
I had a question for both of you, Ryan and Wendy. For Ryan, what is your favorite story to tell, and would you tell us? And for Wendy, as an artist, I know you kind of have your favorites at different times of the things you create. So what has captivated you right now, the thing that you've created recently that has captured your attention, and can you explain to us why that has captivated you?
You know, actually, it's
It's an Ojibwe story.
yeah, it's this picture of Ojibwe leader, Anishinaabe, not Ojibwe. Anyways, you know, you know what? It's not anything that I created. I really have to say, I did this, like I said, I did this Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, and I got to choose the Smithsonian institutions I wanted to work with. So I worked with the Natural History Museum, the National Anthropological Archives, and the National Museum of the American Indian. And in the National Museum of the American Indian, I think there's like 80,000 objects, indigenous objects that were collected by Hi. And that just blows my mind. And then out of that, like 80,000 objects, they have probably like close to 1,200 Crow objects in their collection. And so, you know, I was having a conversation with my father, and I asked like the different names within our family that I could look up. And so I gave that to the archivist, the different names, and she like put them in the computer, and then out popped out 127 objects that were directly associated to my family. And through looking at those, that's how I found my third great grandma. And so to me, it's more, not that I'm making anything, it's more that I'm starting to sort of piece these things together and then find the photos, you know, of my relatives, and like, you know, to have a picture of your relative and then like there's a saddle in that collection. I was like, this is my third great grandmother, and she used to sit on this saddle. And you know, to see the archivist like just be like, whoa, it's like so much more real, instead of like these drawers that you're pulling out and you're just seeing these objects. You're like, this is this woman. And then to do further research and like learn that she died of tuberculosis and she had gangrene, and like it's like a whole full complete like lived story. And she had 3 husbands. It's like, okay. I mean, it's just like so interesting. But I mean, to me, it's not really making, it's more discovering that I'm really totally hooked on. I don't know, I'm deep into it right now, and it's just fascinating to me. The other thing that they had, Crows were notorious for horse stealers. Like, we really loved stealing horses. And it was like one of the things that in order to be like a man or a chief, one of the things was you had to steal horses within an enemy camp, which was really hard to do. And even like Lewis and Clark came through Crow country, and they never saw a crow, but we stole all their horses. See, I'm bragging about, you know, not me, but yeah. But within that, I found, you know, my second great grandfather. His name is Beartail, and he had sold some of his grandfather's stuff named Greenskin, and so there were 8 medicine bundles, and so I didn't look at them, but one of them was a horse stealing medicine bundle. I was like, that is the shit. I mean, that's hardcore. So I don't know, I'm just totally nerding out and really deep into it. And I don't know, I feel like we should all be looking at our ancestors. I mean, it's just like mind-blowing to think about how we came to be, you know, how individuals got together, and it's messy and it's also really amazing, but like, you should look at your ancestors. I think it's so important. And really, I think the reason why I'm so interested in it, because it really puts a perspective on, like, you know, the present and why things are now, and then moving into the future. And having a 12-year-old daughter, and like I said, look at this. Look at all these folks that are standing behind you. So I think that's long, but that's what I'm currently geeking out on. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many. I don't know which one to tell, but listening to Wendy talk, I'm reminded of a dream actually that I had I don't know if it was 2 or 3 years. I had it for many years, and it was about this bear who sits at the base of this, looks like this tree with these berries on the tree. And I had this dream over and over and over again, and then suddenly the dream got longer and longer and longer until I had the whole story. And the story is there was a time when Anishinaabe people were starving and not really living in a good way. I think they were hit by bad crow medicine.
But, you know,
All our horses were stolen. Our birch bark canoes
they
were
weren't
gone.
that great either.
This is completely falling apart. We should go home soon.
It's the next podcast is
yeah.
you two like back and forth.
Teasing each
Insults.
other. And this village was in very, very dire condition, and all the people were sick. There was sickness rampant, and there were these 3 young people that were out trying to gather food for the people, and they would stand at the base of this huge plant, and it was like a blueberry bush. And in the dream and in the story, there was a time when the blueberries grew on trees, but they would grow in individual berries. And so the young people would climb these trees and pick the berries one by one, but they were sick. And so they would run low on energy and only be able to pick a couple of berries. And so they started to pray about asking for help. And so they petitioned the Creator, and they put out tobacco, and they asked for the berries to be brought lower to the ground, so it wasn't so hard to gather this medicine. And the Creator heard their prayers and lowered the berries. And so they got really excited and climbed, but still they were too high in the trees, and it was still too hard. So they petitioned the Creator again, and the Creator listened and brought the berries lower still. And again, it was too hard for them to gather enough medicine for the village. People were dying at this point, and they petitioned the Creator one more time. The Creator said, here's what I will do. I will put the berries on the ground in bushels, and so they won't grow one by one. They will grow in bushels. But in doing so, I need you to promise to not abuse this medicine, because it's a very powerful medicine. And those Anishinaabe youth agreed. And so the Creator goes back to wherever the Creator comes from, and then the Anishinaabe youth just started ravagely just eating these berries, and they're covered in blueberry juice. And the Creator looks down and sees what's happening and says, I knew it, because humans are dumb and we're greedy. So the Creator calls a council meeting between our 7 clans and calls the clans together and says, we need, if we are going to live in relationship with Anishinaabe people, we need to decide who's going to watch over the medicines. Because if we leave it up to the Ojibways, they're gonna fuck it up. And they're gonna eat everything and pick everything, and they're gonna, and the bear volunteers. And he says, I will be the protector of the medicines. And this all came in a dream, in many dreams. And so I went and I asked an elder about this dream, and I said, I don't know what to do, and I recounted the story. And then he sent me to another elder who's like one of our Medewan ceremonial story keepers, and he basically told me that I had dreamed about the way our clan system started. And he said, there are 4 origin stories of our clan stories, and you carry 3 of the 4. And I didn't know that. And then he said, and you're being given the blueberry one specifically. And he asked if somebody was sick in my family. And I said, not as far as I know. And he said, you should go ask everybody in your family if they're feeling well. It turns out my dad had cancer, and I didn't know. So my dad goes for cancer treatments. I go back to the elder and I said, I found out my dad was sick. And he gave me blueberry root. And blueberry root is a cancer medicine. And so there's a root, a stalk in a blueberry bush that when you dig out, so a blueberry bush is like a mushroom shape, and when you dig it out of the ground, it's a mushroom, the root system is a mushroom shape underground as well. And you have to be very careful when you dig it out, but there's a root in that stalk that is very, very potent cancer medicine. And he gave that to my dad, and my dad is still with us today. So that's something that I had dreamed that I think for some reason came to me to help my dad, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. That was great. Megan has a question back
You
here.
want a longer story? I got
That was beautiful.
halfway through, I was like, how is this gonna, oh my God.
So,
Yeah, my question is a follow-up for Wendy. You were talking about the items you found in the Smithsonian collection. I want to know how you feel about those being part of that national collection, whether they belong back with your people or with your family, as opposed to being there in the Smithsonian.
Yeah, it's super weird. I mean, they have the NAGPRA, which is Native American graves in, what is it, Annika? Thank you. See, there we go. But that only applies to like ceremonial objects and burial goods and human remains. So, for instance, like those medicine bundles, like I potentially could through lineage, they told me, because my dad would be the next one in line, and could possibly bring those back. But for instance, I think we would get more use out of the more utilitarian objects like that saddle, because we still parade and use saddles like that, or objects like that. So it's sort of this kind of weird thing where, you know, medicine bundles are actually quite taboo in Crow culture. There's like a real fear of them because they have these certain things that are only known to the original owner, and like really weird things. Like my grandpa, you could never have like an extra pair of shoes, and he couldn't eat kidneys, and you can't put a knife on the stove, else you die. And so, like, since a lot of those things are lost, you know, the community is sort of very afraid of the bundles. So it's sort of a weird thing. I mean, it was just very real. Like, I travel around to different institutions that have Crow items in their collections, and I see them, and I relate to them. I understand they're from my community, but to have like 127 that are really actually like blood related, and I have photos of these people, was a whole nother thing. In one way, it's like kind of just like fucked up all around. Like in one way, it's like, I was like, well, it's kind of nice that they're in there, and like I'm here, this generation, and can see that. But then if there wasn't colonialism, I would know how to use those objects and how they would function, be able to make them and stuff like that, you know? So it's just kind of like a double-edged sword all the way around. One thing, though, that I always think about when I'm seeing them is like, man, I wish my dad was here. Or, man, I wish my aunt was here. Or I wish, you know, other community members were here. Or just like the general public doesn't even realize that they, you know, if they're interested, like, even we walk through a little bit of the underbelly of this institution. It's so exciting because it's so different from like the polished upstairs. I mean, no, I'm not talking about this.
I didn't show you the really
when I was at the
scary
Met, it is a dump in the underbelly, and it's so cool to see that. But the fact that you can have access to these collections and see these items, people just don't understand. It just takes like someone who wants to ask the questions and reach out and do the digging. And so I think that's something institutions, especially if they're going to take on the responsibility of having these cultural items, they really need to put in practice of providing access in some way to those communities and creating a direct line. Because tons of my tribal members don't even know. They have no idea. And like, when I first started really getting into looking at these objects, like there's this one floral jacket that was labeled Crow. And to me, Crow was like geometric designs and these certain colors. And I was laughing. I took a picture of it and I sent it to my friend who is a white guy actually, but he's like a Crow historian. And I was like, they think this is a Crow jacket, ha ha ha. He's like, oh, actually that is. And then he sent me a picture of one of our chiefs wearing it. And I was like, shit, like, okay, like I get shafted left and right every time when I go in there. And so I just think, it's just a way for us to like know who we are. So institutions, like I think just figuring that piece out. It's beneficial to the institution too, to have me in there making jokes and like, it's so funny. I'm going to one more thing. At the Smithsonian, they have like this Crow woman who's in their book of like dresses. And my mom, she's white, but she worked for Indian Health Service as a public health nurse. So she knows everybody in the community. It's given all their baby shots and all of that kind of stuff. And I was like, do you guys know who this woman is? Our community is pretty small. But she was in there as like a maker of a dress. And she's like, oh yeah, I remember her. Her husband was having an affair on her, and then she beat this woman up, and she went to the ER. And I was like, that's the kind of archive I want. Like, I would like to attach that to that dress that she made, like, just like, it gives like a whole new, like, rich, beautiful context. But yeah, I think it's super beneficial to have that two-way conversation.
The Royal Ontario Museum bulldozed a burial mound in my community in 1957, and the corner of the mound was going to slide into the river. The riverbank had sort of eroded due to rising river levels due to the dam put in by the Boise Cascade Pulp and Paper Mill, and so they would fuck with the water levels. Anyway, so the mound was in danger partly of sliding into the river, and so the ROM comes and bulldozes the whole thing. They take all the cultural material out, and I made a film that partly dealt with the disappearance of this mound, and so I contacted the ROM and I wanted to go see the material. And at first they were very uneasy because I said it's not an option. I'll be in Toronto this date and I want the material out, or I'll go to the press. And so this guy was like, oh, fuck. So he found what he could. And what was really interesting was I got in trouble for that because I didn't talk to my elders first, because they're like, how are you going to protect yourself? Because we have beliefs about the power and the spiritual significance of these. Yeah. Of these items. And so repatriation is really interesting and difficult because we have a land claim in our territory where we're trying to get our land back, and it's where these mounds were, which connect to the Mississippi River and mound culture and all of this other stuff that I'm trying to put together. But to repatriate it, now we need a museum, or do we rebury it? Do we want to show our own cultural material to ourselves? Are we charging people money to come in and see it? So it's really caused a lot of problems, which was not my intention. I was just it was a weird flex on a museum that...
Did they let you see the stuff?
Yes, yeah. And we've brought our elders there, actually. I brought a delegation in June of 13 elders and community members that came to look at the material. And it's been a really fascinating process of kind of asking ourselves, so what if we get this material back? What then? So it's a really tough question.
You probably, that museum has a complicated history with dealing with various groups of people, so you probably scared them to death when you did. So good for you.
Well, it was just a weird flex, and I was like, what's he gonna say? Like, he has to do it, and I really wanted to see it because of the injustice, and it will knowing that mound was there and knowing what that was fundamentally means we are going to win the land claim. We have been fighting the land claim for 30 years. I knew that mound was there. Everybody denied the mound was there. I knew it, and we fought for it, and we're going to win. We win. So that's why we fought so hard to see the cultural material. And there are pipes in the material, it's a significant collection, so, but it's a big old complicated mess that we don't have the money and the resource to build a museum, and we got all these problems now, so careful what you wish for.
We're in the same boat.
Yeah.
Well, we have spent 90 minutes with you tonight, and it has been a fantastic 90 minutes. I know we could probably continue, but I'm going to officially thank you all for being here. Jordan, Wendy, Ryan, thank you very much for coming to Des Moines and talking with us tonight. Laura, thank you for your moderation.
We had a gentleman that had his hand up very politely. Can we do one?
Okay, if you all can stay, I'll give it.
Just sit down. You guys are fine.
I had 3 issues, but we'll narrow it down to one. Earlier,
Issues.
what?
Issues?
Well, topics.
Oh.
Earlier this year in Iowa, Indigenous people in Sioux City, primarily Native Americans, organized an event for presidential candidates. Elizabeth Warren was one that participated. It was on the front page of USA Today, the Des Moines Register, covered in the New York Times. My question, is that a good idea? Is that maybe the best way that Native Americans can make political candidates deal with some of the injustices and the way they were cheated out of their land, pushed out of places that white people wanted to come to? Is that the best way of dealing with that problem today in 2019?
I'm Canadian, so I don't know. I don't know if you care what I think, but I would say yes and no. In Canada, what's really interesting, we talked about briefly last night at dinner, is we have this idea of political buy-in by Native people, that if we join the system and we run for office and we get involved politically, that we can change the system from within. But we know that system was literally meant to kill us, and that rejection of the system at least allows us to remain at least ideologically sovereign and declare our nationhood outside of the system. Participating in it, though, makes it complicated, and some people that don't know better say, well, you should have a Native political party in Canada, which would, again, just mean that you are enforcing this system that is no good for us. In the U.S. context, I would say I think it's more important in the U.S. to do everything you can to push a conversation about Native America and the history of this country, because it is largely absent from, you look at statistics around NPR, let's use NPR. Public radio listeners will know, you've probably never heard a Native voice on that radio station. They publish diversity statistics every year. It's less than 1% of people that work inside of NPR nationally that self-declare as Native American, less than 1%. We see diversity initiatives all the time in the art space, in the comedy space, in the theater space, film and TV space. We are always a fraction of a percent in the actual space. When I tour doing comedy in this country, people are disappointed when they look at me because I don't look Native. And so the sense that I get, and I'm way out of school here, is that Indians lost the wars, and that's it, and they're American. And the conversation is very different in Canada. So I think whatever people can do to make the Native American question present in America, for me as an outsider, is a good thing. But I'm Canadian, so who gives a shit what I say?
I think that was really good. I don't even think like we're American. I think we're just invisible.
Right, yeah.
And mythological unicorns. Yeah. The fact that there's two of us here is pretty incredible, you know? Something about that kind of makes my skin crawl, but I also think it is important to get that sort of national attention, like Ryan was saying, that like Native people organize this. And I will say social media has been such a great platform for the sort of Indigenous voice. And that we've been able to like use that voice to change things, which we weren't able to do in the past. So I think that's really wonderful. But yeah, I don't know. It's so crazy. I think also people think Indigenous people are like liberal and Democrat and like. Just like I think it was last year, it was so embarrassing for me. The tribal chairman of my tribe, President Trump came to Billings, and like they went there wearing their war bonnets and stood behind Trump. And I posted that on my social media, and everyone was like, "Are they protesting?" And I was like, "No, they like Trump." And people were like, so like they're like, "Why? What? That doesn't make any sense." And I just have to remind people that like we're people, we're humans, you know? And so like that's another thing that people have to understand is that Native people are people. And although I don't like that was crazy to me, like to see that, and like the whole the tribe was sort of like, whoa, they just went and did that, you know? But yeah, I think it was sort of funny that people are like, oh, they went in there as activists. Like, no, they like legit were there, like supporting Donald Trump. So I don't know. It's like, that's the other thing too. Like there's a pressure, but to realize it's far more complex. It's not a simple answer, and that Native people are humans, you know.
And hopefully, like, you know, 300 years from now, it's not Native Americans that we're talking about.
Won't be here.
It's, well, that is so dark. Oh, God. I need to go back to Canada. This is too much. But that we're not talking about Native Americans, that we're talking about actually specific Indigenous nations, that we don't get to use this broad term. In Canada, we're I think a little bit further ahead in this conversation, where people understand what you mean when you say Cree or Dene or Anishinaabe or Tuscarora, like that there's, you know, you can see the colors.
I think that
they
is
wear.
so important too.
Yeah, because right now it's just Native America, and we're not a monolith. There's diversity amongst ourselves. Some of us go to church to pray. Some of us climb a mountain to pray. You know, some of us vote for Trump. Some of us love Barack Obama. So and we're not there yet. You know, we're still doing.
No.
We're not even at the 101. We're not even doing 101 stuff because we're still proving we're alive.
Exactly, yeah. All right, we'll end there.
Way to end on a high note there, Wendy.
Well, thank you very much. Let us say thank you. Well.